so that people can hear this who are not on it. And again, we think we're going to turn this into a series because we have so many people doing really cutting edge stuff. Brendan DeMelle is executive director of DeSmog. He's also a freelance writer and researcher specializing in media, politics, climate change, and clean energy, having served as research associate for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., researcher for the Ring of Fire, researcher for Laurie David, law and policy analyst for the Environmental Working Group, campus organizer for Connecticut Public Interest Research Group, environmental justice associate for EPA Region 10, among other positions in his career. DeMelle's provided writing and communication services on a wide range of topics, with a demonstrated ability to simplify complex technical issues into concise, accessible language for general public consumption. And I will just say, DeSmog has just proven to be a really critical resource for us in Climate Social Science Network. So Brendan, you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you, Timmons. Wonderful to see everyone. I'm going to try to share my slide. Or actually, I guess first things first, I got to share my screen. And here we go.
Here it comes. Okay. It's good. Yep.
You see okay? All right.
Yep. Yeah, looks great.
And then let me do the present. Sorry. No, that's the wrong one. Sorry.
Try again. That's fine. Take your time. There you go.
Cool. Okay, cool. All right. So I today am here to start the theme of what's new in climate obstruction, which I'm very excited to talk about. Obviously, DeSmog focuses on these issues full time since launching in 2006. The two organizations or sort of networks that I'm going to talk about, focus on today, are PragerU and the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. So PragerU started in 2011, so it's not necessarily what's new in climate obstruction, but it is newly problematic in the sense that its edutainment content, its videos, have been accredited for use in schools in Florida, Oklahoma, and now Texas. So they've got some momentum towards the idea that their video content could be used in an actual school setting. And then on the right, the new and truly scary organization that's been created, led by Jordan Peterson, who I'll get into some detail about, is this Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which has its first public event happening on Tuesday in London at the O2 Arena. So these both are super spreaders of science denial across many issue areas, but obviously our focus being on climate change science denial. So I'm going to get into a little bit more about how each of these entities has created a really troubling trajectory in the spread of denial. And Jordan Peterson's been critical to both organizations, which is why his face is splashed at the bottom of both, underneath both. Younger Peterson on the left. If you visit PragerU's website or are introduced to their content through YouTube video, you're funneled into a sort of start here with this video of Jordan Peterson explaining to younger people. A lot of their content's aimed at sort of high school and college age kids. And this video is Jordan Peterson explaining to you, young person, how to fix yourself. And his first sort of line is, the proper way to fix the world isn't to fix the world. There's no reason to assume that you're even up to such a task, but you can fix yourself. You'll do no one any harm by doing so. So you can notice sort of the subtle tactical effort of turning young people against the idea of working on global problems like climate change right from the start of this sort of edutainment programming. And a lot of what PragerU does is, bait the hook with sort of softer content, advice videos on issues young people might care about, like learning how to invest or save money, or a lot of it looks like self-empowerment advice. But it gets more troubling as they set the hook with something more populist seeming, like a rant about how expensive college is, and then sort of reel into other videos that get into the deeper waters of conspiratorial thinking, attacking everything. And again, like I said, I'm not going to talk about the range of the work that Prager does that is, in my view, racist, deeply troubling in gender and other areas. But like I said, I'm going to focus on the climate aspects of what they do, which is to get people to question the science. They attack everything from renewables to electric vehicles to ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing. They have been huge and featured heavily in our report on COVID science denial, as well. Huge spreaders of fear of climate lockdowns, a lot of conspiracy theories about how everything's designed to take away your rights and how this is all just a warm up for climate lockdowns. They've also attacked the concept of 15-minute cities, neighborhood level organizing. So again, common themes between Prager and ARC are sort of demonizing liberal education, turning people away from activism or advocacy, and they're both sort of culture war factories. A lot of focus now on woke, anti-woke, anything that has to do with ESG, as I mentioned. Peterson and a lot of the folks that are now associated with ARC are sort of the leaders of that anti-woke sort of organizing or attacking, we'll say. Both these organizations operate on a global scale. I've mentioned some of their US specific influence, but they're not just in the US. And obviously, since they're on YouTube, they're spreading everywhere. They also each have a news companion component, and I'm going to get into a little bit more depth on who owns these or who funds these efforts. But PragerU has the founders of PragerU also founded the Daily Wire, which is a conservative news, news in air brackets. And then the ARC, the founders of ARC also founded GB News, which is a UK-based sort of Fox News misinformation center. But they're different in certain ways. ARC Forum, the newer creation, is built on the celebrity of Jordan Peterson and the celebrity of the advisors and board members and sort of big names that they've brought in, including several former prime ministers of Australia, a current presidential candidate in the United States, Vivek Ramaswamy, and then big names in climate denial, Judith Curry, Bjorn Lomborg, Alex Epstein, several more that I'll get into. But when Peterson posts a video, it gets millions of views because he has a massive following. Whereas PragerU relies more on sort of smaller V viral approach to getting views by cultivating their audience to share content among sort of non-celebrity audience. And they recycle a lot of older content and push sort of evergreen disinformation themes, rather than tying their news, tying their content to the news cycle. They also use heavily paid advertising and boosting of their videos to get them into sort of people that might not necessarily see their content. So as I said, something that each of these entities share is financial backing from the fossil fuel industry. So let's see if I can, there we go. DeSmog's been reporting on the Koch funding and connections to PragerU for a long time. This was an article on the left that one of our correspondents wrote about Koch funding of an effort that was attacking electric vehicles, and a PragerU connection to all of that. So we know that Koch's had a $10 million campaign against EVs, and they were using PragerU as part of their strategy to get people to distrust electric vehicles and electrification. And you see a lot of their work is related to just fear-based messaging, designing to sort of get people to fear change, which of course we know the Kochs have used in many ways. So beyond the Kochs, Prager, this is the founder of Prager, and the Prager sort of empire. Dennis Prager, who's been a conservative radio host for many decades, but he launched PragerU in 2011 with the intent to, quote, spread Americanism through the power of the internet. They now describe their aim as to challenge dominant left-wing ideology in culture, media, and education. And they, the funders behind it, the big money, are these fellas on the right, the Wilks brothers, Ferris and Dan, made their money through selling their fracking technology company for $3.5 billion, and then investing significant sums into the creation of, or the success of PragerU. They've contributed over 8 million and counting to PragerU, and as I mentioned, they launched the Daily Wire as well, so with $5 million. The Wilks brothers are, hit the next slide, there's Ferris on the left and Dan on the right. I'm not going to read those quotes, but you can sort of get a taste for the other ways that they have centered all kinds of interesting, to say the least, views. They are they control a foundation. Ferris owns a foundation called the 13 Foundation. Dan leads one called the Heavenly Fathers Foundation, is more focused on religious content, but they engage in sort of religiously charged political activism. Ferris is an evangelical preacher, and has said that the climate crisis is not only not a problem. He says if God wants the polar caps to remain in place, then he will leave them there. So he's got extreme sort of fundamentalist views, doesn't believe in climate change, among other things.
1 minute, Brendan.
Okay, great. Yeah, just a couple examples of sort of some of their climate denial videos, as I mentioned. They're trying to get people to be confused by and undermine the science. They somehow lost track. The Climate Action Against Disinformation did an analysis of their recent climate denial videos to show the spread that they have and the tremendous influence. PragerU has received over 7 billion views on its videos. They now average over 1 billion views a year. So a troubling amount of reach that they have. And as I mentioned real quickly, the new flavor is ARC, led by Peterson. They are extremely scary in the sense that they are, as I mentioned, Peterson's been able to platform a lot of climate deniers who used to be, folks that we focused on for years, who used to get sort of fringe traffic, are now getting millions and millions of views thanks to Peterson's YouTube reach. And this small group of folks on the right have collectively gotten over 5 million views after being interviewed by Peterson. Peterson's also launching a Peterson Academy, which is similar to PragerU, online university, launching next month. So again, I wish I had more time. Happy to take questions, but there's an overview of a couple of the major super spreaders of denial from my perspective.
Brendan, thanks. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries.
And maybe we will have time for questions. I think we will at the end, and we can hear what people want to talk about. But I do want to encourage everybody to go to the DeSmog site. There's just big stories every week on important climate disinformation and obstruction. Okay, so Viveca Morris is next. She's a research scholar and executive director of the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale Law School. She's which is a multidisciplinary initiative dedicated to addressing large-scale industrial abuses of animals and their impacts on the planet. Her recent research focuses on the role of agribusinesses in the climate crisis, something that got very little attention for a very long time. Strategies to hold agribusinesses accountable for their climate impacts and policy reforms needed to make the U.S. Agriculture sector more humane, sustainable, and resilient. Viveca, have at it.
Thanks for having me. You can see my slides?
Looks great. Okay,
wonderful. Thanks. So I'll just give a brief overview of this topic. Much could be said on it, but I can't recommend DeSmog's agribusiness database highly enough. So if any of these topics catch your interest, I really recommend checking out their website. Okay, let's see if I can advance here. All right, so as background, collectively, the greenhouse gas emissions of 15 of the largest meat and dairy companies are now estimated to exceed those of some oil giants like PetroChina and ExxonMobil. These livestock and feed companies, as Timmons said, are not always thought of as climate superpolluters, but they are, and their emissions need to be reined in accordingly to prevent a future of catastrophic warming. So it's important to understand before we launch into the obstruction that the scale and urgency of the animal ag emissions problem is well established. Even if fossil fuel use ended completely right now, global emissions related to food production are on course to push warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And most of that food-related warming, an estimated 57%, is from meat and dairy. Within the meat and dairy industry, these emissions are deriving from multiple sources. The main sources include emissions from grazing land and cropland that produce livestock feed, deforestation, soil disturbance from cropland expansion, as well as enteric fermentation from ruminant animals like cows and sheep, and manure management. So I mention this because the greenhouse gas footprints of these companies are therefore dominated by Scope 3 emissions, which account for about 80 to 90% of their total emissions. And these Scope 3 emissions are in turn made up largely of methane and nitrous oxide, which make this industry's climate contributions particularly significant. Livestock supply chains are now estimated to emit about a third of all human-caused methane, making them the largest anthropogenic source, and about half of all human-caused nitrous oxide emissions. So part of understanding what's new in climate obstruction requires going back a bit to 2006, which was the year that the world first became widely aware of the livestock industry's contributions to the climate crisis. That year, the UNFAO published this landmark report called Livestock's Long Shadow, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, which included the first global estimate of animal ag's contributions to climate change. And the report, in addition to making this estimate, made the case for a polluter pays principle that would require livestock holders to be held accountable for these emissions and other environmental externalities. Yet, here we are nearly 2 decades later, and measures to effectively reduce livestock-related emissions are rarely at the forefront of environmental policy. And those major corrective measures that this report called for not only aren't in place, but in much of the world, they're not even being discussed. So this raises the question as to why. And a big part of that answer is that evidence suggests that industry actors, as they have in other industries, have played critical roles in shaping public opinion and public policy in a multitude of ways to ensure they can continue to operate and emit as usual. When this landmark report came out in 2006, the report gained such prominence that it put the beef industry on the defensive in a new way. Industry-funded groups' focus on climate-related messaging and policy expanded dramatically in the years following that report, and that's continued ever since, and it's expanded particularly dramatically in the last few years. And so we continue to learn more about this history. Just this month, The Guardian published an article, which I screenshotted here, reporting that officials involved in this initial UNFAO report felt, quote, censored, sabotaged, undermined, and victimized for more than a decade after they wrote about the livestock industry's methane emissions. And they also said that there were attempts by the FAO leadership to muzzle, suppress, and dilute their work related to livestock and climate. And that the lead author of the report said that diplomats and meat lobbyists also talked to senior FAO managers, encouraged them not to invest further in research dealing with the meat industry's environmental impacts. And this is obviously concerning for obvious reasons, mainly that the FAO is supposed to be an independent and credible organization, but reports like these raise doubts and indicate major industry capture. One of the ways the industry responded to this initial UNFAO report was by funding researchers to produce a critical report of the findings and then spinning and promoting it with misleading headlines like this one from UC Davis in 2009, "Don't Blame Cows for Climate Change." Since these initial investments in the late 2000s, the industry has significantly expanded its efforts to fund academic centers and professors to produce research and communications related to animal ag and climate change that it uses in its favor. One prominent example of this is a center at UC Davis called the Clear Center, whose website I screenshotted here, and which is supported by millions of dollars in gifts from the feed industry group iFeeder and other industry groups. Since its launch in 2018, the Clear Center, an ironic name, has become the most prominent academic center defending the US livestock industry from climate-related criticism, and it does this in a multitude of nuanced and sophisticated ways. And Dr. Jennifer Jacquet of CSSN at the University of Miami and I document this phenomenon in a forthcoming paper, which was supported by a research grant from the network. Oops. these are just a couple examples of the industry's attempts to shape public opinion and public policy. But broadly, despite their outsized emissions, animal agribusinesses operate today in what the nonprofit IATP has aptly called a profound accountability vacuum. So despite more than 15 years of research attributing major climate impacts to the industry, most policies to mitigate livestock emissions remain insufficient and dominated by industry-supported financial incentives that are both voluntary, subsidized by taxpayers, and woefully insufficient. So this free pass for agriculture was demonstrated even in the text of the Global Methane Pledge, which was agreed by the US and EU in 2021. And that text agrees that the signatory countries will work to achieve all feasible reductions in the energy and waste sectors, but it makes no such commitment for agriculture. And instead, it focuses on incentives, technologies, and partnerships. And this is despite the fact that the animal agriculture industry is the #1 global source of human-caused methane pollution. And indeed, recent reporting by Unearthed has revealed that the beef industry went to great efforts to ensure that agriculture escaped this global methane pledge unscathed and celebrated when it did. In the past few years, multiple leading dairy and meat companies have made public commitments to becoming net zero. These include JBS, Tyson Foods, Nestle, and Dannon. And so the question that this raises is how in the world are these companies going to meet these promises? And in some ways, your guess is as good as mine. None of the net zero commitments, to my knowledge, made by major meat and dairy companies call for reducing the number of animals in their supply chains, which is the source of roughly 90% of the industry's emissions. And quite the opposite, most have plans to significantly expand their production. These pledges are also characterized, in most cases, by a startling lack of transparency. For example, to reach its promise of being net zero by 2040, JBS has said that it will spend $1 billion on unnamed emissions reduction projects and another $100 million on R&D to help producers mitigate emissions. But it doesn't explain what these projects are, how much emissions they'll reduce, how much of the emissions reduction will come from offsets, et cetera. And the company also doesn't publish the data needed for independent actors to verify their emissions claims. And when companies, do have more thoroughly outline their action plans, these plans often focus on emissions intensity per kilogram or unit of product produced, rather than on absolute emissions, which is inadequate for obvious reasons. Or they focus just on scope 1 and 2 emissions, projects like greening their manufacturing plants while ignoring their supply chains. The industry's focus on aspirational emissions reductions through technological innovations is central in its messaging. Estimates for mitigation potential of technological interventions like feed additives for cattle or biogas digesters, which I'll talk about here, vary dramatically across studies, but even the most optimistic projections indicate that these technologies are woefully inadequate to address the industry's projected emissions increases. So, one example of such technology is biogas digesters. As many of you may know, at large industrial dairy and hog factory farms, animals' manure is typically collected in giant pits, euphemistically called lagoons. And in these lagoons, manure breaks down anaerobically, which produces methane. And this methane can be captured with these technologies called anaerobic digesters. And these have been around for quite some time, but they're expensive and they're only economically viable at large farms with significant government subsidies. And in recent years, the government has been giving many, many millions in these subsidies. So more large farms are now capturing the gas emitted and piping it into natural gas pipelines, where it's then sold as renewable natural gas. These farms receive credits for their pollution reduction, typically through programs like California's low carbon fuel standard, which they are then able to turn around to sell to other climate polluters to offset those polluters' emissions. And some large dairy farms in California now are reportedly making more money from selling this gas than they are from milk. And so it's important to remember that the manure emissions here are just one and a fairly small part of the total emissions from the cattle on these farms. And so this is a solution that requires enormous government subsidies to address just the manure emissions while completely ignoring the enteric fermentation, land use, the feed emissions, et cetera, and incentivizing the continuation and expansion of a massively polluting system of farming. And while the industry has promoted its own favored solutions like these, another major one is feed additives. The policies that they've opposed are equally notable in recent years. These include opposing emissions reduction reporting requirements, opposing the removal of harmful subsidies, opposing emissions taxes, and other common sense and more transformational actions like linking crop insurance payments to sustainable practices. And then meanwhile, as one last example, Meanwhile, climate-friendly meat labeling is on the rise, again, with little transparency. Earlier this year, Tyson Foods launched a new brand of beef called Brazen Beef, which claims to have a 10% reduction in its climate impact. And Tyson sought and received permission from the USDA to include a climate-friendly claim on its label in March, and these products are now available in supermarkets. And multiple journalists have investigated Tyson's claims, but effectively none of them can figure out who is collecting the emissions data, what methods the company is using, what assumptions they're making, or if and how the results are being verified by a third party. And it's also not clear what baseline Tyson's using, so 10% less than what. So this is a labeling that's very likely to confuse consumers. And it's bad enough that the USDA would greenlight this, but okay, great, I'll wrap it up. It's bad enough that they'd greenlight this, but it turns out the USDA is also funding it through one of its grants through its Climate Smart Commodities program, which is one of several ways in which the USDA is supporting the animal ag industry's solutions to climate change. The agency gave out $3.1 billion to 141 projects in recent years, including many led by major meat and dairy companies like Tyson. And so this program is just stunning to me. The USDA, they didn't publish a standardized methodology for how it assessed greenhouse gas emissions in making these grants. It appears to lack standardized monitoring of the grants implementation. And furthermore, the agency doesn't give the public meaningful information on what these projects even are. So in exchange for up to $60 million of taxpayer funds given to Tyson Foods for a Climate Smart Commodities project, all the US taxpayers get is this sort of paltry 2-sentence description of the effort. So this is obviously concerning in the sense that it's effectively looks like a corporate handout. So there's much more that could be said on this and other topics related to animal ag corporations, but I'll leave it there for now and welcome any questions at the end of the event or by email after. Thanks.
Viveca, thanks. I guess the name Brazen is rather appropriate in this case.
Yeah,
appreciate it very much. Our last speaker is Dieter Plehwe, who's a senior fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center, the Center for Civil Society Research, and lecturer in political science at the University of Kassel. He's a visiting scholar at the AXPO Observatory of Market Society Polarization in April 2023, and a fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in the academic year 23-24. His research areas include international and comparative political economy, neoliberalism, think tank networks, and environmental, energy, and climate politics. He co-edited Market Civilizations in 22, 9 Lives of Neoliberalism in 2020, Roads from Mount Pelerin in 2009 and 15, Liberalism and the Welfare State 2017. He serves as the editor of the journal Critical Policy Studies and launched the data repository and blog, which we will share with you in a minute. I consider Dieter like one of the great encyclopedic resources and most knowledgeable people in our network. So Dieter, thanks for speaking today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Timmons. I wish I would think that for myself. I have little time to speak a little bit about what's new in climate obstruction, both about the Atlas Network and in the Atlas Network, which is a daunting task. Oops, why? Oh, no. Okay. Why Atlas? Just a quick reminder. This is a global network of think tanks that was founded in 1981 by Anthony Fisher, basically a close collaborator of Friedrich August von Hayek and many other organized neoliberals. It was founded to coordinate the future expansion of the network. His daughter lists about 100 organizations of Atlas think tanks until he died. And the capacity that has been created has been increased to 500 since the global financial crisis. So it's about the creation of capacity and about coordination, what one might think of as soft network coordination involving both centralized and decentralized elements. This is one thing we are thinking much about. There's a strong normative alignment of neoliberal and social conservative orientation and direction in the network, bridging conservative secularism and religious conservatism to secure economic freedom. This is very important. This is sort of like an effort also of a big tent alignment of right-wing forces. Yes. And in the field of climate environment, it translates in anti-environmental and anti-climate, anti-regulation in the fields of environmental and climate policy. Way back 25 years ago, Andrew Rowell has written a book on the green backlash, where he talked a bit about the paradigm shift, which puts the green movement basically on the sort of like negative side in public imaginary. So whitewashing the responses, the business and think tank responses to the green movement, the wise use, multiple use, preservation, sound science, responsible stewardship, and red washing at the same time the green movement and otherwise washing, turning it into a project of religious fanatics, of communists, of elitists, and so on and so forth. So very much the language of modern populism, right-wing populism. I wanted to share this quote because I thought it was hilarious that Andrew Rowell observes in 1996. In fact, for the first time, what we are seeing is a blueprint or template of anti-environmental behavior. What we find is similarity of techniques being employed in different countries. So writing about the global backlash, he observes that in the 90s, the first time there seems to be something going on, similarities in different countries. And he points to the wise use movement, which was central in the US as a small player compared to the big players of the global PR and global industry. And yet many, if not all, of the key organizations that he mentions across the book are actually all part of the Atlas network. So it's a kind of an interesting thing that they were already at the time was something he didn't see in this observation of a very important observation. So how does alignment work in network coordination? In Atlas, there is a coexistence of centralized and decentralized forms of network governance. Well, maybe first to say that important organizations like Cato Institute or the Heartland Institute are all part of the Atlas network. So, of course, we know these organizations better than the network. We have sort of like efforts to coordinate the network from the center by offering resource bank meetings, coordinating funding, and getting together funders and think tanks. We have competitions and prizes that are distributed, also giving money. Many think tanks in global South countries, of course, little money goes long ways. We have a think tank master program organized in Washington, and we have the funding and fund channeling going on. Second element is we have transnational interlocks, of which a large share are by Montpellier Society members, that is organized intellectuals, mostly academics, that are all members of a neoliberal core organization founded by Hayek and others in the 1947. And to this day, so like in the hundreds of people that sit on think tank boards between countries. We have joint projects, the economic freedom indexes being maybe the most important, where environmental and social regulation are considered a negative for economic freedom measurements. We have the strategic replication. Now I get to the heart of the presentation today, the strategic replication of think tanks in opposition to climate change and in other important ways. And we have what I call strategy mobility, that is counter campaigns to prevent or roll back policy transfer in the field of climate mitigation and in also many other fields. Just a couple of examples of the strategic replication examples. This is nothing new. It's maybe an effort to try to think about these things. It's, of course, the founding of think tanks that are dedicated to denial. It's the most important, I think, strategic replication effort. Heartland in the US, founded 83, but expanded enormously in 1993 in response to the Rio conference. Frontier, founded in 1997 in Canada. The Free Market Foundation in South Africa, founded in 1975, but 2001 exploding or starting to have strong output on climate. The South African Institute of Race Relations from 1929, but again from 2013 expanding strongly in climate content. We have Pisers, Benny Pisers, CCNet, founded in 1997 in the UK, which later is then, he also is the founder of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. This list could go on, and I hope at some point we have a sort of like a much more detailed list I don't have now. Just for example, in other areas, the strategic replication of the Acton Institutes of Catholic neoliberal organizations founded since 1990 in the United States, and in the meantime also in Argentina, in Rome. The Faith and Work Institutes founded in 1991 in the US, and in the meantime founded in many other countries in the world. These are parts of the Atlas network, but also are circuits of Catholic religious global networks. And they are also, of course, participating in cross-religious efforts in the field of climate denial and climate obstruction. Another interesting example for strategic replication is what the Capital Research Center does in the United States, namely the observation of enemies like the environmental movement, or actually also dissenters in the own ranks like the Niskanen Institute, which is then negatively analyzed, and that also led to that the Niskanen Center left the Atlas network a couple of years after joining them and being not feeling like part of this network. And a very similar organization has been founded in Germany, the Prometheus Institute, which does the same, basically observes all the kind of activist NGOs that it considers bad from an economic freedom perspective. Now a couple of examples on the subject of strategy mobility. I mean, if you have the capacity to organize the think tanks in many different countries, and you have apparently ways to coordinate some activities, you expect that they're also able to carry out kind of joint campaigns, counter campaigns. One was recently described by Amy Westerveld and Geoff Dembicki, namely basically building on the theme that also already Andy Rowell had picked up, that the Green movement was redescribed as a communist movement or as a religious fanatic movement and so on. And now the new theme on the last generation is the terrorist movement. So basically the activities of the last generation have been described as terrorist efforts and Amy and Geoff explained basically many different examples in different countries. So I think we see an updating of the older theme of red washing or religious washing of environmental movement organization as terrorist, obviously with the interest to step up the criminalization of these movements and discouraging young people to basically participate. Another example, of course, is the way in which themes run across the content of organizations. We're still in the middle of the process of analyzing about 40 to 50,000 climate content pieces of the think tanks across the world. Interestingly, of course, much of the climate policy related content is actually coming from very few organizations, maybe 10, 12, including Heartland Frontier, Independent, Global Warming Policy Foundation, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. So kind of a relatively small number in terms of the Global 500 is actually producing the bulk of content. So it's interesting to look, of course, what these organizations do. I share here just sort of like a quick result from the Africa MENA group, where we can see that contrary to what actually recently many people have been thinking, that the climate denial theme is actually making place for other themes, we see the black line that climate denial in the Africa MENA, and here it's actually just South Africa, because there's the two think tanks that produce the bulk of the content, is actually not disappearing. It simply continues to be a part of the activities. And of course, we have coded other important elements of the of the discourse, including ad hominem attacks, alternative solutions. We see that alternative solutions claims technology will do a better job in the future, and so on and so forth, have gained a considerable share of the content that is produced. But for me, in the moment, because I was never so happy with the observation that climate denial is disappearing, because I thought that many of the major denial think tanks are actually simply continuing the same story. And it's actually more interesting, even because if you look at the climate denial only on the right side of the graph, you see, it peaked in 2012 between the South African Free Market Foundation and the South African Institute of Race Relations. I mean, it remained sort of like up there. This is not a lot of content, obviously, compared to Heartland and others. But if you look at the two organizations separately, it's very interesting that you see that the Free Market Foundation indeed stopped pretty much doing it in 2013. And exactly at the same time, the South African Institute of Race Relations picked up the theme of climate denial, so denying that climate change exists or has anthropogenic causes.
But one more minute there, Dieter.
Yeah, I'm done. It's basically sort of like gives you sort of like a little bit of a glimpse of what we hope to soon be able to show on a much broader basis of data. And also what we also hope to do is hope to find is that this sort of like power group of climate focused think tanks, the ways in which they are in fact in a specific way interrelated around the globe. But so much so far. Thank you.
That's great. So a round of applause to all our presenters, really helpful, and you've opened a great bunch of topics, and now you can see my panel has reassembled at the front table here, and we're open for questions. I guess I would just start by asking Viveca and Brendan if you see the same trend that Dieter was just talking about of strategic mobility, spreading across groups, that we have a few groups that are creating sort of new ideas and strategies that are then being picked up by a lot of other groups. I'll ask Brendan first and then Viveca, and then we'll have questions. And people can raise their hands so we can ask in order.
Yes, certainly. So yeah, with both the examples I provided, Prager and ARC Forum, there are some Atlas fingerprints as well, and there's the sort of global coordination strategy that Atlas has led on since 1981. Some of the same tactics, and in fact, with ARC and Prager, part of their strategy is to, rather than try to, their strategy really is to supplant what the media, create new media outlets, create new sources of education, as they call it, rather than just simply trying to tear down the existing system. They're trying to replace it with their own, which has a global implication. They're trying to do this all over the world, and using the internet, which is of course global in reach. So there's lots of troubling activities in both regards that connect to those themes.
Likewise, in the animal agriculture industry, I think what we see a lot of is that the trade associations are the most sort of prominent and aggressive often of the industry, various industry groups, promoting messaging, funding research, et cetera. So I think that certainly serves as a both essential and sort of unifying force and an opportunity, I'm sure, too, for the messaging and the strategies to spread among those members funding those efforts. But I don't think that there's been any work, at least to my knowledge, of the scale that Dieter's taken on and quantitatively and systematically focused on animal agribusinesses. So I think there's a tremendous amount that could be learned by applying those methods and strategies to this field as well.
Totally agree. So I have two questions, people in the queue. Maybe make sure you introduce yourself and turn on your camera if you would, Jared Abrams.
I'm unable to turn on my video, apparently.
Oh, okay. That's weird.
The host won't allow it, but that's fine. Hi, my name's Jared. I'm based in Tel Aviv. I work for an environmental organization known as Green Course. And my question's relating to the climate denial think tanks. I guess I'm wondering if the best method in dealing with them is establishing our own network that produces more think tanks that are pro-climate, or what are the other ways of best dealing with this?
I see some nodding and smiling. Dieter, you go first.
I think the numbers question is actually not unimportant, because when Anthony Fisher and these people set out to found and fund think tanks, it was clear that you need to spread the same message from as many different places and voices as possible. So it's basically in hegemonic struggles in the knowledge field, it's basically different from other fields where if you control maybe one central point of of communication, like strategically able to select what is important, what is not. That doesn't work in the knowledge field. You basically have to have think tank capacity on the ground in the different countries. And they have actually demonstrated something the other side may actually still have to learn, namely the added value of the transnational linkages between these organizations. I see a lot of organizations on the other side that do not have shared board members, that do not seem to communicate on a very regular basis as part of the normal business about their efforts and so on and so forth. So it's, but of course, I mean, and then it comes to the question of funding. No? I mean, Anthony Fisher went out there and helped people found and fund think tanks. And if we want to try to do a similar thing, I guess we still have to find the money to do that.
Thanks. Anybody else on that one? And now participants can turn on their videos. So James, you want to introduce yourself and ask?
Yes, hi everybody. My name is James Painter. I'm at the Royce Institute at Oxford University. Just to pick up on Dieter's central claim that maybe climate denialism is not disappearing, and you've always been worried that people are claiming that. My understanding is no one is arguing that climate denialism in its traditional sense is disappearing. It's still there in very important pockets, but the shift of emphasis on the addition of policy obstructionism or response skepticism is what we're interested in, and what are the context and factors that drive that. So it's really a specific question to Brendan and Viveca. Brendan, you didn't really, you went very quickly, but were these two organizations, what's their balance in terms of, traditional climate denialism versus policy skepticism, and also what's your experience of Big Ag, Viveca? Are they, really concentrating their efforts in proposing policy which might affect their interests, or are there vestiges of climate denialism there as well? Thanks very much.
Excellent question, James. I'll go first real quickly. So from DeSmog's perspective on ARC and Prager, there is I would say they run the gamut, but the fact that Jordan Peterson has platformed some sort of traditional climate science deniers, people who actively still hold on to the belief that CO2 is good for you and that global warming isn't even real. He has platformed folks like Judith Curry and Alex Epstein, the pro-fossil fuels guy, and others who are really, still holding on to some pretty core climate denial claims, and then also platforming and suggesting climate solutions denial. We see people say, oh, well, yes, it's a problem, but it's not, you can't fix it this way or that way, or you can't, regulate how it's fixed. And then, of course, crisis denial, people that saying, oh, well, yes, it's a problem, but it's not that bad, and we've got other problems to deal with, like Bjorn Lomborg and others. So there's a range, but the fact that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that Peterson has amplified the voices of folks who were sort of the original climate science deniers into the stratosphere now in terms of reach is problematic. So Viveca?
I would say that climate denial, flat out climate denial is not that common among animal agribusinesses now, but certainly minimization of the role of animal ag's role in the climate crisis is quite common. And I think that, if you look back at the 1990s, the American Farm Bureau Federation, others were engaged in sort of classic denial, but perhaps because it didn't really come to light until, the mid 2000s, and it wasn't an area of, central public focus until much later than it was for many other industries. I think the nature, at least anecdotally from what I've seen, is focused on both minimization, in some cases shifting blame and saying that to focus on animal ag would distract from the real problem at hand, being fossil fuels, and then increasingly, I think, framing and advocating for policies proactively that present animal ag as the solution. And I think things like substantial subsidies for feed additives and other green technologies that are not as promising as I think the industry's marketing would like us all to believe.
I just wanted to jump in with some pointing people to the work of John Cook and Travis Cohn. who else is on that? Mirjam Nanko, Konstantin Brusalis, where they're tracking over time the rise and fall of different discourses and using machine learning. So they have that article, I think it's in PNAS or something like that, quite recent. Maybe it's somewhere else, +1 or something. But they look at these super claims of global warming isn't happening, greenhouse gases aren't causing global warming, climate impacts are not bad, climate solutions won't work. So that's what James was talking about with these sort of policy skepticism. And then the fifth super claim, as they call it, is climate movement or science isn't reliable, and that the climate movement is hysterical, or religion or so on. But what's really interesting is we've been a little frustrated that they didn't have enough about the solutions, and so now they're redoing their typology to a series of claims about the policies. So either the climate policies are harmful, they're ineffective, mitigation policies are unnecessary, climate policies too difficult, climate-friendly alternatives won't work, we need fossil fuels, there's no need for more action. So sort of trying to incorporate some of the stuff from this Discourses of Climate Delay paper that William Lamb led us on. So anyway, just to say that we're running this machine learning, we're training the computer right now, and we're going to see what happens when we put in 3 million speeches from on the US Congress floor and just see what happens over time. So I think, in general, it's true. We're still seeing some denial, but it's shifting. But then there's a lot more of this attack on the solutions and the policies and so on. Anyway, that's just it. But there's always been attacks on the policies and the solutions, as Bob Brule points out. I'm waiting for another question. It's noon. It's been an hour. I think we could officially end, or we could take one more. How about that? We started about 2 minutes late. People may have places they need to go. Is there any questions in the chat? No. So let's wrap this up and just call this a sort of a down payment on a new series of talks on what's new in climate obstruction. And I want to give my thanks to Brendan, to Viveca, and Dieter. Awesome job. I learned a lot, and I look forward to learning more in the future. Anything else, Stephanie? Anything I'm missing?
Nope. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Big round of applause. Everybody take care of themselves. Thanks for coming. Look into cssn.org, and we'll be glad to reach out and fill anybody in or connect people with our scholars. Take care.